Welcome to Living in Color. I'm your host, Farah Nasser, and today we're talking about immigration, how newcomers are viewed by society and why, the obstacles immigrants face when they arrive in a new country, and more. Today I'm joined by Sara Asalya, founder and president at the Newcomer Students Association of Ryerson, as well as Wennie Lee, who is an instructor at Humber College's Immigration and Refugee Law program. Sara and Wennie, thank you so much for being here. I'd love to start with just laying some groundwork here, because I think people often interchange the words immigrant and refugee. Wennie, let's start with you. Can you tell us the definitions of both these terms and how they differ?
Immigrant essentially relates to individuals who come under family class, skilled workers, or entrepreneurs and businesses. But refugees are those persons, and I'm simplifying, those who are fleeing persecution and is trying to seek a safe haven in another safe country.
Okay, so those are two very different things.
Absolutely.
All right. Sara, I'm going to turn it over to you. You both have such different perspectives because you've been here for decades, and Sara, you've just been here in Canada for 6 years or so.
Yeah, correct.
Let me ask you, how do you find that you have been treated being here in Canada, but also, do you find that immigrants, depending on where they come from, are treated differently, and basing your research on, I guess, the group that you work with at Ryerson?
People of color and immigrant people of color in particular have been treated as outsiders because they don't fit within the dominant group or the dominant culture in our society. And you know what? Simple things and that occurs in our day-to-day conversations, you know, in the subway or when you're lining up waiting for your coffee and people hear you talking, and they would, just the way you speak English or your accent would prompt people into asking you the question of, where are you from? And it really irritates me because if you're having a Middle Eastern accent or an Indian accent or you know, an Arab accent, people would kind of say comments such as, oh, you're having such a heavy accent, you know, we're having difficulty understanding what you're saying. But if you're an immigrant from Europe, for example, all of a sudden this accent's become a cute accent, and you would hear comments.
Sexy accent.
Exactly,
Yeah.
comments of, oh, you have such a lovely accent. And so it really, and even what is the answer for this question? Sometimes you would be a second or third generation and speak English as your first language, and people would still ask you the question of where are you from, because based on your skin color or race or ethnicity or culture.
Why do you think that is, Wennie? Why do you think people are treated differently depending on where they're from?
I don't think there's any rational answer to that. I think innate in all human beings, we have an irrational sense of trying to identify where you come from. So even second generation Canadians may still be identified with a particular identity as to where are you from, or that curiosity as trying to find out where your roots are, or why do you still have a different accent from what quote unquote is a Canadian accent.
Does it bother you when people ask you where you're from?
To a certain extent, yes. It depends on how the question is asked. If it's in a social setting and it's just conversational and it's a genuine curiosity to know where you're from, I don't have a problem with that. But if the question is directed as to where I'm from will then define my professional abilities, I have a huge problem with that.
So well put. I'm glad you said it that way, Wennie. Let me ask you both, because we have seen, I mean, I anchor the news, we've seen a lot more hostility toward immigrant groups. There's really a percentage of the population who feels like jobs are being taken away from them, that they think that immigrants are getting a free ride, or refugees are getting a free ride specifically. Why do you think there is that hostility still, when we know that an influx of people, immigrants, are good for the economy, help make Canada what it is? Why do you think that is, Sara?
I think I can think of two main reasons of why some people might not want to welcome immigrants and refugees into their communities, and you just mentioned some of the words, stealing the jobs, or immigrants are going to be a burden on the community. But I think one of it is the media role in storytelling and how the media is portraying negative images about immigrants and refugees. But the other one I think could be our political leaders and people of power who have a platform to really influence the public opinion and the discourse of migration in general. And oftentimes we find the media is more kind of creating a moral panic in relation to immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers by using languages and terms and adjectives such the one that you mentioned, or we've seen in the media a lot of the stories about these, but also political leaders, and I can't think of a more current example as the United States. As the United
I think everyone does.
It's true. It's true. When we have new emerging words that have been used to describe and to disadvantage a whole population, calling them illegal aliens, that is not even a legal term. That is a term that was created and used by people in the United States. It kind of framed the whole population, and this kind of discourse and the kind of language and terms we use, it influences people's way of thinking about refugees and the attitudes towards immigrants and refugees.
Wennie, I would love to get your thoughts on this.
In terms of the hostility, I think the irony is that even who I call settlers, those who came to Canada earlier, there are microaggressions to our own group. So you came earlier, and the next wave of immigrants who come, and they're coming from the same place that your parents came from or where you came from, but we have this is now my Canada, and I'm going to protect my turf. So there's these microaggressions that are even not just from the broader Canadian society, within our own communities. And that's something that we should all look, not just outwardly, but also internally, in terms of that hostility and why do we have these microaggressions.
That makes my blood boil. The idea of we got in, now we're going to slam the door. There's not enough room for all of us here, which it makes me shake my head that in marginalized communities, how do we still have people who are discriminatory towards people in their own communities? But it happens. Let's talk about some of the obstacles that both of you have faced. I mean, since coming here many years ago, coming here now, the obstacles you faced, and whether you think government and civil society are doing enough to help immigrants and refugees. I'll start with you, Sara.
There are language barriers, there are financial barriers, culture barriers, and I'll just say a quick story about the culture barrier and how it's really kind of an obstacle for newcomers that they have to overcome. But when I came to Canada and I had a meeting with my settlement counselor, and she was asking me to start looking for jobs, survival jobs, look for McDonald's and Tim Hortons. And I responded back, I felt a little bit intimidated based on my experience and why she's asking me to do such kind of job, but this is a different story. And I responded back, I was like, okay, but what's Tim Hortons? And the look on her face, and she was like, you don't know Tim Hortons? Like, this is all what Canada is about. This is the Canadian identity. If you don't know Tim Hortons, how you're gonna supposed to integrate? And she made a big deal about me not knowing what Tim Hortons. And I responded back like, I'm sorry, I have been here only for 2 weeks. I have other things to be concerned about.
They don't have Tim Hortons in Palestine, right?
They don't have Tim Hortons in Palestine or even the Middle East. You know, I'm thinking about my career. I'm thinking if we even did the right decision to move to Canada. There are other things that concern me than what is the popular Canadian coffee shop. And then that little story made me reflect on, like, really, this is just the surface level about the culture barrier. We're not digging into culture barriers in terms of the culture at the Canadian workplace or the culture in different institutions. Other challenges could be the lack of family network and support, lack of access to housing, lack of access to affordable childcare. As a mother, that was a big barrier for me to access the job market when I have 2 children that I have to take care of, but I couldn't afford, childcare. And, social isolation and exclusion could be also considered as a big barrier for newcomers. But for me personally, finding a community that I can belong to while repositioning and negotiating my own identity was the biggest and toughest thing.
Thank you for explaining that. That really explained it well. Wennie, talk to me about what you think the barriers are right now in terms of government, in terms of civil society, in terms of corporations and business.
See, I share a lot of views that Sara has mentioned, and I've been here 30 years plus, and I stopped counting after 30, but it's the same type of issues that what Sara is facing now that I faced 30 years ago, which is issues with employment, issues with schooling, issues with childcare, issues with housing, all of those issues, right, that existed 30 years ago continue to exist now. For example, when I went to law school, there were only two Chinese people or two Chinese persons at the University of Western Ontario. I know that has changed. I don't know how significantly, but certainly just having two Chinese and one Korean in the class is quite something. You are a visible minority. What can the government and our institutions do now? Well, it's debatable. For example, fast forward 30 years, when I walk into Humber College, I'm identified as a student and not as the instructor. When I walk into the classroom, right? Are you taking this course? No, dear, I'm your instructor. So those same issues continue to dominate. As a visible minority, you are pegged into a certain profile and a certain expectation or role. I think that multiculturalism, and it's great to have multiculturalism being promoted by the government, but where should the government resources be concentrated? Is it just funding for specific multicultural groups? I think that at this point, and it's, I know, very controversial, but I think the government should not only promote a particular cultural identity, because that may also separate us. To really, really fuel multiculturalism, I think the government should also have a broader policy stroke in terms of trying to bring all these multicultural groups interact with each other, so that this feeling or this concern about who is this other person. Like, I'd like to learn more about Sara and more about Palestine and where she comes from. And if the funding is only going to a Palestinian or an Arab group, and the Chinese are going to get their funding, and we're promoting the Chinese culture, the cultural identity, where do we meet? Where do we merge? I think we should have more funding for that, where it's a federation of multicultural societies, where we come together as a true Canadian, where we all celebrate multiculturalism in that format.
Thank you both for being part of this conversation, Wennie and Sara. It's great getting to know you both as well, and thank you for being so open and sharing your personal stories with us as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, and thank you guys for watching Living in Color. Thank you for watching Living in Color. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have an idea for a future Living in Color episode, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave them in the comment section.